Morning again, and welcome to our final benchmark talk of this academic year. We've got a great talk for you today entitled Financing and Dilution for Startup Companies. And just a little background, our benchmark talk series is co-sponsored by Biolocity, Georgia Tech's Institute for Bioengineering and Bioscience, and Georgia CTFA. As this is our last talk of the academic year, we'd love to get your feedback on this year's talks. Some of the feedback we're looking for are, feedback on future topics that we could include in our series that will help you develop or further develop your life science technologies. And please use the survey that's listed here on the slide to tell us what you liked and how we can improve. I'll drop a link to this survey in the chat, but we again will appreciate all the feedback that you can share with us. And just so you know, although this is the last talk of this academic year, our new series will be coming this fall, so stay tuned. I just wanted to share a few updates and announcements before we get to the talk. So right now we are offering legal office hours in partnership with the Emory School of Law. These office hours are open to faculty, staff, students, and alumni who are interested in talking about startup-related areas of interest. You can schedule an appointment using the website that is on this slide, but these are all consultations are by appointment only. Another opportunity that I want to share with everyone is funding opportunities through the BARDA Drive network. So Biolocity is a part of BARDA Drive. BARDA is the Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority, and Drive is the Division of Research, Innovation and Ventures. On the slide, it lists the current areas of interest for funding and partnership. These grants typically reach up to $749,000. And if you're interested in chatting about any of these areas of interest, please just reach out to Biolocity and we can talk you through the process. A new opportunity that I want to share with y'all is if you have a mobile app project or idea, there is a new open application for seed grants. So there's an opportunity to have a $50,000 seed grant through App Hatchery and the Children's Healthcare of Atlanta. The grants are due, your grant application is due on July 16th, but to give you a little bit of additional information, in addition to the $50,000, awardees will have this $50,000 over 12 months, and they'll get to work with App Hatchery to support the development of smartphone apps and related software for implementation, either in the clinic or the home. This opportunity, again, is jointly funded by Georgia CTFA and CHOA. So if you're interested, the website is also on this slide, and we can drop this in the chat as well. But without further ado, I want to introduce our speaker of today, Dr. James Stubbs, and I will turn it over to him.
Great, thank you so much. Let me see if I can get myself settled. And I do not like that picture of me, but that's neither here nor there. All right, so everybody should be able to see my opening slide about now, and hopefully that's true. What we're going to try to do is, if anybody has questions, go ahead and drop it in the chat, and we'll save them all up and we'll answer them at the end, definitely. But if there's something that's particularly relevant to a particular slide or topic, Courtney will jump in and read the question off to me, and we'll go ahead and hit it right then. So what I'm going to do is go ahead and get started with just a little bit of an intro about, as they say, me. So right now I'm a professor of the practice at Georgia Tech in the biomedical engineering department. I'm currently on the board of directors of two privately held medical device companies. I've had a pretty long track record of doing medical device types of startups. I got started with my own company, Radiation Dosimetry Systems, that looked at, we were providing a lot of services to drug companies that were doing radioactive drugs for diagnostic purposes as well as for cancer therapies. Then my first real medical device company was Proxima Therapeutics. I had multiple roles in that company: CTO, VP of Scientific Affairs. I ran product development for the radioactive sources that were used in our device. That company was acquired, and I stayed with the acquiring company, Cytech Surgical Products, and then built a very large product development team out in California with them. So I was their chief research scientist for that company, and it was subsequently acquired by Hologic. Focal Therapeutics, I started that in 2008, and that was another totally implantable bioabsorbable device for breast cancer patients. Then I also worked in an additional company that was in the breast health space, Sienna Medical. I was the CSO there. At Focal, I was the CEO, a founder, and the CTO. And a lot of what you're going to hear, particularly about the dilution, comes from my experience at Focal Therapeutics. I started a company called Andari Therapeutics that was designed to do a Class 3 medical device, the only one I ever attempted to do in my career. And then I also transitioned out in about 2013, retired from the operating roles, and got involved in the investor community. And I joined the Atlanta Technology Angels in 2013 and started their health science or life science vertical in 2014. And our first investment was in a company called OB Medical. And that company I was on the board of directors of, and due to some issues the company had, I ended up having to turn that in from an investment into a turnaround. So we had to go in and change out the senior management of it. I ran it for 6 months until I could find a really top-notch CEO to take it over and run with it, which he did. So in my portfolio, Proxima Therapeutics was acquired by a public company for about $200 million. Focal Therapeutics was acquired in 2018 for $125 million. Sienna Medical was acquired in 2018 for, at this point with earnouts, is probably close to $185 million. OB Medical was bought by Philips, and that was a closed transaction that was not, it wasn't talked about how much that was, but it was a much better exit than I ever expected for something that was effectively a turnaround. Andari Therapeutics, it was like my one total failure. We were never able to achieve any funding for that, no investor cash for it. And so that was a face plant and a huge learning experience from that. So that also plays a role in some of the things that you're going to hear this morning. All right, so let's take a look at some of the products that I did in my early career. We did a device for neuro-oncology, a radiation therapy for brain tumor patients. And this is the Gliosite and Iotrex. Iotrex is this fluid here. It's a radioactive source. This was the catheter that was placed into a resection cavity in a brain tumor patient. And you can see some intrasurgical pictures of the device being placed in the cavity after the brain tumor has been removed. And then you can see some results of some of the MRI scans. The one on the left, this shows the tumor site before surgery. And here's the tumor site with our balloon catheter inside the tumor. This is the Mammocyte. It's a breast radiation therapy device that we developed at Proxima Therapeutics. From there, in Focal Therapeutics, this is an image of the BioZorb, and this is a device that's bioabsorbable polymers, and it's placed in the lumpectomy cavity. It takes up the volume that's removed by the lumpectomy surgery, so you get a better cosmetic outcome, but it also has some titanium markers in it that allow you to target that particular part of the breast that needs radiation therapy, so that you can get the radiation therapy done in 5 days instead of the usual 5 weeks, which is a real nice thing for women with early stage breast cancer. The images that you see now over on the lower right, they're for the 2 companies that I serve on boards of right now. One of them is called Oxos Medical, which is a handheld Cine radiography company, and we build these little handheld x-ray devices for orthopedic surgeons. And then Restore 3D, which is a they make custom 3D implanted devices for orthopedic surgery, both ankles, knees. We've replaced actually half of a pelvis from a patient who had an osteosarcoma. And both of these are currently privately held, and they are doing actually quite well. They both got their FDA clearances, and they're in the commercial stage right now. All right, so that's a little bit about my experience. Now, I want to be very frank with you and just give you some perspective so that you understand my biases. I've started, managed, and turned around a number of different startup companies, but they're all in the healthcare space. They are really all in the medical device space. So I'm familiar with having FDA regulation, Nuclear Regulatory Commission regulation, and those are additional challenges that we have that are on top of all the standard business challenges that any startup has, regardless of what your industry is. So, you need to determine what's the market size and make sure it's adequate for you to be able to get investor interest. You have to have good product market fit, which you can only figure out if you do enough voice of the customer. You have to be able to determine pricing for your device. What are your sales channels, and how do you manage the cash and the investors that are required for you to get your business up and rolling? So what I've seen in my career is that when you're successful, it takes a very long time to be able to get this thing across the finish line and actually sell the company to an acquirer. And in my experience, it's been 8 years to 11 years. Sienna Medical took 13 years to get acquired. However, when the company idea is not viable, that we shut down really fast. Andari Therapeutics, when we found out what our core reason was that we were not able to gain industry traction, which was because we had a competitor that arrived in the space that was actually pharma. It was Botox for trying to treat overactive bladder in women. And when we found out that that was the case and that they shot from 0 to 100 million in revenue in 12 months, I mean, it's unheard of in medical device land. We shut down the company the next week because we knew we were never going to get anywhere. So when you're going to fall and you're going to fail, go ahead and you know what's happening, just pull the trigger and be done with it. So I'm personally not at all familiar with doing rapid and easy fundraising. At the points in my career that we were doing fundraising, it was pretty hard. But I will tell you, and I'll hit this as my last 1 or 2 slides, the COVID era of the last 18 months has been really weird, totally unexpected, but in a good way for entrepreneurs. Now, I've never done a SPAC, one of those special purpose acquisition companies that you've been hearing about lately, or an IPO. That's just really not in the space for medical devices. There's been at least one medical device company that did go public via SPAC, but there hasn't been an IPO in a long time. So my experience has been acquisitions by public companies only, which is great for the ecosystem because the big medical device companies like the Medtronics and the Strykers, they do not do product development well. They just don't. They rely on startup companies and the entrepreneurs like you to do that innovation, to do the revolutionary types of technology, and then they come in and buy it, and then they can scale it from a commercial standpoint. And it really maximizes what both sets of the ecosystem do very, very well. So I truly loved my time as an entrepreneur. It was some of the funnest, most challenging, sometimes the most terrifying times of my life. It is really cool to bring a new product to market, to get it into hands of clinicians and see them improve patients' lives, in some cases saving lives, but you're solving real problems. And that's really, to me, very, very, it's good psychic karma. I've really enjoyed that, but I hated fundraising. You've probably heard the term a trained extrovert. That's what a lot of us engineers are, who've been able to push ourselves out of our comfort zone of dealing with machines and computers and things like that, and actually had to interface with a lot of people, put on the happy face, and go shake a lot of hands and get turned down a lot. It's kind of painful. But all entrepreneurs are totally open to helping other entrepreneurs. So for those of you who are starting down this journey, please don't think you have to go this alone, that you have to tackle every single problem out there on your own. Man, we want to help you out. you know, it's with the exception of a direct competitor, you're going to get as much help as you ever ask for. So please ask for advice and ask questions. You will get it. It may surprise you, but you will get it. And one of the last things I just wanted to mention on this is one of the things that entrepreneurs do is we do create a lot of value in this world. And this is really important to remember sometimes when things are going slow or they're going tough or you're having a hard time or things aren't working, either technically or from a human capital standpoint. You are doing hard things, but it is so totally worthwhile. You create a lot of value. Over the course of my career in the 5 companies that I've started or been involved in, we've raised somewhere close to probably 100 million in venture capital. We've sold all those companies for close to $500 million and probably created somewhere in the neighborhood of 200 to 250 jobs at the time the companies were sold. And these were high paying jobs in product development and medical device sales. So we really did create a lot of things that, in addition to the wonderful products for healthcare. So a lot of things like that. It's a great thing that you're doing. So what you're about to hear over the next couple minutes, 20 minutes, 30 minutes is just my personal experience. And the one thing I like to quote to a lot of my students is the most dangerous sample size is an N of 1. When you talk to one person, they give you an answer. You have to go figure out by talking to other people, is this true or is this just one person's experience? That's all you're going to hear today is my sample size of 1. And with that said, I think you may have a bit of an understanding of where my biases are and where I'm coming from. I'm a small company person. I like that environment. I've been in the big company and it's not my cup of tea. So with all that said, let's get cracking and start talking first with, how do you start bringing money into the company? What does that look like? And you have to start, of course, with corporate structures. There's a handful of structures. A lot of you will get started with a limited liability corporation, the LLC. This is really common when you get started, and it gives you that corporate veil that can give you a little bit of protection. You will move out of an LLC as soon as you start getting investors in the company. S-Corps are typically done for what we call lifestyle businesses. That's like a consulting firm that you want to have, or you want to run a pizza joint or something like that. That's typically an S-Corp. It's a much simpler corporate structure, and it's a total pass-through of the profit and losses from the business right to the shareholders. Same thing for the LLC. You will not use S-Corps or LLCs for investor financed companies. They just don't. They can't do it. They can't. In fact, venture capital investors cannot. They're prevented from investing in anything other than a C-Corp, which is the next subject we're going to hit. Again, investors require you to use this, and there's a ton of real benefits for it. Number one, you can have multiple classes of stock. So you have common stock for your founders and your employees, but then you'll have preferred shares that will be associated with the different rounds of financing that you're going to do over the course of the company's lifespan. And we'll talk about those as we move along. Now, investors who put money into your startup, they're going to expect to make multiples on their investment, or just simply to lose it all. And they expect you as the entrepreneur to have that mindset. So an early investor, in the angel rounds or a Series A, they're going to expect a 10x to 20x type return on their investment. The investors that come in at late stages when you're supporting commercialization efforts, their expectation on a return is probably closer to 2 to 3x. And I will show you at least some examples of the returns that actually happened in one of the companies in my career. All right, so let's talk a little bit about C-Corps, the pros and the cons of them. You have an unlimited number of shareholders and types of shareholders. And by type, I mean class of shareholders. You can have common stock holders, and then you'll have preferred stock. And you can have multiple series of preferred stock, Series A, B, C, etc., depending on how many rounds that you do. You can do stock options. You can do restricted stock, and you can issue warrants. Common stock and its derivatives that you see here, they're crucial for founders. So the entrepreneurs who start the company, you're going to have common stock, and you should do it in the form of restricted stock because there's some tax advantages to do that. Once you've raised cash and established a valuation, restricted stock will lose its value in terms of its utility over time. You will still have restricted stock as founders, and it will continue to vest, and that will be good for you, but you won't use that to give equity compensation for your employees later. For that, you use stock options. Warrants, which are really just a type of stock option, they're typically reserved for investors, particularly those that, for whatever reason, manage to actually have some leverage over the entrepreneur or the company when they do a round of financing. It's a way for them to goose their returns that they're going to get on the money that they put into the company. Now, there's a thing called QSB, or a qualified small business. So if you start a C-Corp, you are essentially starting a qualified small business. And the beautiful thing about this is if you hold your stock in that company for 5 or more years, it's tax-free. There's no capital gains tax applied to it. When I did Focal Therapeutics, the vast majority of the equity that I held in that, both the founder's equity and the Series A rounds that I participated in directly, that was all under a QSB. So I didn't pay any capital gains tax on that. Later rounds that we did up to Series D, they had some of those, I had a 50% exclusion and a 25% exclusion on some of those. So it's because I didn't quite have the 5 years under my belt for those. So this is a huge implication for you founders, because in the healthcare space, it'll probably take you more than 5 years to get liquid on your startup. And that actually is a great thing from a tax standpoint as it stands right now. Venture capital funds can invest in the LLCs and the S-Corps, known as pass-through corporations. And the Delaware C-Corp is the most common type of C-Corp. You can do a Georgia C-Corp, and there are some angel investing tax benefits to doing that if you're going to run your company here in Georgia. But generally speaking, as soon as you take on venture capital investors, they're going to require you to switch over to Delaware as your state of incorporation, because their business legal code is very, very friendly to the businesses. But I would want you to be aware of, if you do a Delaware C-Corp, their tax return fees can be absolutely shocking if you don't know what the trick is. My first letter from Delaware after incorporating said I owed $185,000 in state taxes. This was like 6 months after I started Focal Therapeutics. I had no revenue, no investor cash. I just issued 6 million shares and I held it all. Bang. I filed my first tax return in Delaware, and they hit me with a $185,000 tax bill. But my CPA, my accountant, was smart enough. He had experience with this. He knew the alternate way to determine the valuation of the company. And it's not associated with the number of shares. It was associated with the actual assets of the company. Ultimately, my Delaware fees were like $200 instead of almost $200,000. So this is some of the things that can pop up and bite you on the ankle. But please, when you get surprised by stuff, just start calling people who should know, have been through it before, and can help you out with some of those issues. So are there disadvantages? Yeah, there are, but they're really none of any importance. And it is the expectation that you will be a C-Corp, probably a Delaware C-Corp. All right, so now you started your Delaware C-Corp or your Georgia C-Corp. You want to start bringing some money into your venture. Well, there's a number of ways to do it. And the cash requirements, how much money do you need to actually run your company, is going to vary by a lot of different factors. The first one is going to be the stage of the venture. If you're at the very early stages and you're just getting started with product development, you're working on your MVP or your proof of principle prototype, the amount of cash you need probably isn't that high. You don't have a large headcount, and you don't have a lot of expenses in the product development stage at that point. Now, as you start moving further and you put your product into design control, you're going to start having regulatory and potentially clinical requirements. So depending on what your clinical path or your classification with the FDA, if you're class 1, class 2, or class 3, that has pretty significant implications for how much money you're going to need, because that has big implications for what your time horizon is from getting the venture started to the point where you can actually start selling your product. The other potential large cash expense is clinical trials, if you need to run those in whatever business you're doing. A typical class 2 device that's not a de novo will not require a clinical trial to get permission from the FDA to go ahead and start marketing. A class 3 device, you're going to have to run a pivotal trial, which is a true, it's almost like a phase 3 type of randomized clinical trial for effectiveness. You're going to have to run that, and that can be a $50+ million study. So it's very, very expensive. Then the other big expense is associated with what type of commercialization strategy you plan to utilize to get your product into the market. My experience has been predominantly with putting on direct sales forces. There's a lot of advantages to doing that, and there's a lot of disadvantages to doing that. The biggest disadvantage is it is not cash efficient. It's very expensive to put on salespeople because the target compensation for a typical sales rep in our line of work, medical devices, is about $250,000 to $300,000 per year. So you can see each salesperson you have is going to put your cash burden of like $20,000 to $25,000 per month per rep. It's pretty expensive. The alternate way is to go through distributors, and there are pros and cons to that. It's a lot more cash efficient, but you don't necessarily own your customer anymore, and you don't have interaction very often directly with your customer. So you don't know how your product's being received. You don't necessarily get the feedback from them on what they like and they don't like. And that's super, super important for you to understand as you're continuing product development, fixing problems with your device, optimizing your marketing, and then going after Gen 2 of your products. Then we can look at the types of financing, and they're really broken down into just 2 specific broad categories. Non-dilutive financing, which is cash to your venture, and you don't issue stock in return for that. That's why it's called non-dilutive. Then there's equity financing, where you, in return for taking investor cash, you issue stock to them. That is a dilutive or equity financing. So let's start off and take a quick look at the non-dilutive financing side. So there's only a handful of sources, and they go from very, very hyper-localized foundations, friends, family, and the way some people like to call it, friends, family, and fools, that give you money to get your venture started. Then there can be access to state level grants. And you heard Courtney talk about a couple of those options before I got started. So you can have Georgia Research Alliance, CTSA, or some other organization that actually has some cash, and they will issue grants to you for you to do very specific tasks. At the federal level, there are Small Business Innovative Research and Small Business Technology Transfer grants that you can get phase 1 and phase 2 for both of those. And probably the Department of Defense and NIH are probably the 2 biggest awarders of those types of grants. I would note that if this is an area that you're interested in, and you really should be interested in this, at ATDC, there's at least 2 people there. Connie Castile is one of them. That's their job, helping entrepreneurs do SBIR, STTR grants. So I would strongly put in a little bit of a pitch for going to ATDC and seeking out some help with those grants, because it's a real good service that they offer. And those things by themselves are complicated enough that you could run a full seminar just on that. So that's all I'm going to say about those. And now we're going to start looking at other forms of bringing investor cash into your company. And the first one that many of you who maybe you're at this stage, is convertible notes, debt instruments. And here, there's really like three major economic terms on a convertible note or in a safe note. And it's the interest rate, which the typical industry average is like 8 to 10%. So you're borrowing money and you're going to essentially accrue interest on it at 8 to 10% per year. Then there's the cap and the term. And I'm not going to get into what these things mean in detail, but the cap is going to be a number like $4 million. And that's a way, putting a cap on the debt instrument is a way for that investor to make sure that they really kind of optimize and maximize how much equity ultimately they're going to get in return for the money they put into that convertible note. And then finally, there's a discount, and this is just a percentage discount on the conversion to equity, and 10 to 20% is typical. And the way that works is, let's say you do a qualified financing, Series A, a year after you've done a convertible note, and you had a 20% discount on your convertible note. What that means is if you issue shares at $5 per share in the Series A round of stock, your convertible note investors are going to get their shares at $4 per share. They're going to get a 20% discount to the share price of the venture capital investors who come in at that qualified financing round. Now, so this is a debt instrument. What happens next? I mean, normally if you borrow money, you pay it back, right? You pay it back with principal and interest. Well, in theory, you can do principal and interest payments when the next equity financing happens. You do what's called a qualified financing. This is really rare. And the reason why is no new investor is ever going to let their cash that they just put into the venture be used to pay off old investors. They want all the money they put into the company. They want it to go to work doing product development, building inventory, doing sales and marketing. They want real corporate action that is going to improve the value of the company, not pay off the early investors. And quite frankly, the early investors don't want to get paid off anyway. What they want to do is have their cash that they put in converted to equity and then participate in what they believe to be a major multiple on their original investment when you actually get liquid on your company. So what it ends up happening more commonly is the principal and interest will convert into the stock type of the next financing. So with most of your companies that you're taking convertible notes or safe notes right now, it's going to convert your Series A into Series A preferred shares. That's what the early investors under a convertible note will receive. They will not get common stock at this time. That's the most common way. All right, so I guess the other thing is when that conversion does happen, the debt's wiped out. So that comes off of your balance sheet as a short-term or long-term liability, and it gets turned into equity instead. So you can consider convertible notes as they're totally non-dilutive until they get converted at the next financing. And we'll touch on this towards the end when we walk through a long example of what dilution looks like under multiple rounds of financing. All right, so what are typical rounds of financing? Well, we almost always start off with what we call a seed round. I would note that there's an organization called PitchBook, and you can find them online, I think at pitchbook.com. They aggregate data from angel rounds and venture capital rounds across the United States and sometimes worldwide, and they put it all in one place, and you can go search for trends in venture capital financing by round, by region, by industry, or you can look at specific companies like a competitor company and see how much money they may have raised and when did they raise it. So that's a great resource for you to get, and I'm going to use a little bit of their data a little bit later in the talk. But in your seed round, you're going to be picking up money from the friends, families, and fools and angels. Then when you move into Series A, that's really when you're getting the professional or institutional investors from the venture capital firms. You'll do a Series A, and you'll do a Series B, and you'll keep doing this until you have a liquidity event. And the liquidity event is one of two things. your company gets acquired, and then all of the shareholders then get paid for the investments that they made, or the company gets dissolved, you go bankrupt. As soon as you take investor money, you are essentially in it to win it. And the investors expect you to do everything in your power to create a big multiple for them based on, the investor money that they put in to begin with. All right, so now that we've continued to move into the dilutive or equity type financing. At first, we've got the angel fundings. Now this comes in very, very early. So they may be at a point where you're doing proof of principle prototyping or something extremely early. They typically come in for pretty small amounts, 250K to 5 million. I mean, when I first was with ATA, an angel round never went over like $750,000. Some of the angel rounds that I see now are 5 million or more. It's been quite a shock, but the angels are filling the gap that the venture capital industry won't touch anymore. Venture capital funds have gotten so big that they need to put a minimum of usually 10 million per investment into a company. And to do that, that's not, seed round, and in general, it's almost not even a Series A anymore. So one quick note on angel investment in these sizes, you can get the angels to pull this amount in aggregate. So that 250 may be the sum total of 10 or 20 different angel investors that are putting in small amounts. As long as those investors, those angel groups, pool that money and put it into a single corporate vehicle like an LLC, an investment LLC, this is good because it makes it easier for you to deal with fewer shareholders on your cap table, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But you really want them to do that because you don't want to be collecting up $2,500 investments from, 100 different investors. I mean, that's a nightmare just to get yourself up to $250,000. So keep that in mind that if they won't bundle them in, you need to be ready to offer creating an LLC and bundling all of them into it so that you can actually prevent that cap table damage. All right, you can do crowdsourcing such as Indiegogo or Kickstarter. I've never seen this done in medical devices because mainly a lot of those times you have to promise to give somebody free product in return for their investment. And the timelines are usually so long, it's not reasonable to tell somebody, hey, for $100, I'll give you, one of my catheters 9 years from now. That's just doesn't happen. But it's Series A and later when an actual value is placed on the company, a numerical financial value is placed on the company. That's done by venture capitalists. That's at your Series A and all the subsequent rounds that you do after that. You will keep doing rounds of preferred stock until you either do an IPO, which again in medical devices is pretty rare, your company gets acquired, or you're bankrupt. These rounds are usually large. They're typically greater than $8 million today. And you can see some Series C, D, or E for commercialization support. They can be 30, 40, $50 million, really big. Initial coin offerings, I've never seen that in the med device space, but I've heard it talked about. And there's been at least one company that's gone public using that special purpose acquisition company, a SPAC. Those things seem to be losing a little bit of their luster for different entrepreneurs. And I would certainly not want to go that way. Being a public company, it costs you about $2 million a year just in the organizational maintenance and administrative things that you have to do to be as a public company. So it's a terrible use for your capital unless you just have to do it in order to get some of your venture capitalist liquid. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some of the financing basics. And the first one is, you'll hear this term all the time. What's your pre-money value? Well, that's just what is your company worth, before the investment has been made. And I think this is probably most easily explained using a specific example. And here, let's say your pre-money value was $4 million and you're going to take a $1 million angel investment. So $1 million's coming into the company. Your pre-money value before it comes in is 4 million. And that means your post-money valuation is 5 million. It's 4 plus 1. And the angels now own 20% of the company. Now, I'm just making these numbers up for right now. Your particular pre-money value is going to depend on a lot of different variables, including the experience of the investor that you're bringing on board, market conditions, your corporate progress. You can look at PitchBook, what I mentioned a few minutes ago, for current trends on that. And you can see what the typical pre-money value is in, for example, medical technologies. What's pretty interesting is in the medical or the healthcare tech, which is what we do, before 2020, you could expect a seed round, something that you're doing with angel investors. You could expect a pre-money value of like $2.5 million here in Atlanta in the Southeast. You take the same company and plop it down in the San Francisco Bay Area, your pre-money value might be more like $4 million. They're just not nearly as sensitive to pre-money value over there. And quite frankly, they have more experience doing early stage investing over in the Bay Area. All right, so the next thing that's really important for you entrepreneurs is liquidation preferences. And a liquidation preference is just a special set of rights that shareholder classes get for a specific payout before any other class of shareholder that's inferior to them. And I'll give you an example that if your Series A shareholder put in $5 million and they have let's just say a 2x liquidation preference, and let's say you sold the company a year later for $12 million. Well, they're going to get their $5 million times 2, 10 million, and the 2 million that's left over is going to get distributed to the common stockholders. That's just the way it works. So that's what liquidation preference is. You want to try to get your liquidation preferences to be 1.0. These days, entrepreneurs probably can hold that. There were times when the economy was not good. It could get 2.5x. Then there's this thing called participating preferred. This is where the preferred share class, like the Series A stock, they get their preference that I described up above. Maybe it's 2x. And then they convert to common stock on a one-to-one basis, and they get a pro rata share of what was left over. So out of that 2 million, they're going to get a shot at some of that too, from the example I gave before. Oh, this is awful, totally awful. You do not want this. If you can avoid it in your term sheets that you agree to in any round of financing, don't have participating preferred. You have non-participating preferred. And this is where the investors in those preferred rounds, they either get their preference or they convert to common stock with everybody else and get a pro rata share based on that. If your acquisition price is big enough, your venture capitalists will convert to common stock because they'll get more money doing a pro rata, conversion with pro rata shares as opposed to just taking their preference. And there's a lot of great examples for this that you can find online for, showing you how the math works. And it's also demonstrated in a book that I'm going to show you in a little while. All right, so let's take a look at angels. Angels are really just either wealthy individuals. A lot of times you'll call those super angels, people who put in high six-figure to seven-figure numbers, like 500,000 to $1 million into a company. Those are considered to be super angels. And these folks are going to come in before VCs ever do. They expect to get a decent chunk of the company, 15 to 33%, almost a third of the company in many cases. They're going to ask for, particularly if they're coming in with a large amount of money, for a board seat. And so here's an opinion, but based on my experiences, do not either try to limit angel investors to observer status on your board. That way they can't vote on things that the board of directors does, but they can offer, you know, some advice and stuff like that, but they have no vote in things. Or if you have to give them a true board seat that has voting rights, sunset it. And by that, I mean, have them drop off as a member of the board of directors at the next qualified financing. And the reason you do this is most angel investors do not have a lot of industry specific expertise to help out the CEO and the management team. So they're really no use on the board. The timeline for a return on investment for the angel investors in our industry is super long. I mean, it's the fastest I've ever seen it for a class 2 medical device was about 4.5 years from start of the business to the point where they actually sold it to a public company. Most of the time, it's more like 8 to 12 years. So the length of time is very, very long. And angels very rarely participate in subsequent rounds of financing. They're in at the beginning, and that's all they're comfortable with. They don't lead around, and the meaning of leading around is providing a term sheet that gives those economic values. And the biggest part of it is they're just no good at giving a real good pre-money valuation to the company. That's not what their wheelhouse is. Venture capitalists are very good at that. And that's why you have priced rounds for your series A, B, and C. Angels typically use the safe and convertible notes. And again, doing those two different vehicles, they don't establish a pre-money value, and that's fine. They'll have a cap, but that's different. Angels will often syndicate, you know, like ATA would oftentimes syndicate with the AIM group out of Alabama, and the Palmetto group and UCAN out of South Carolina to aggregate a larger chunk of money. That's what we did when we put money into OB Medical, and that allowed us to ask for and essentially demand a board seat. All right, so just a sidebar on the angel side of things. Many of these angel groups like ATA don't typically pool their members' investments, and you can end up getting a lot of little tiny shareholders. And this really complicates your cap table because you'll end up having one line for every single person who put in whatever your minimum is, like $2,500. When you have, and there are certain actions you have to get shareholder votes for, like issuing more stock, doing a preferred round of financing. The board can't do it on their own. They have to get shareholder approval. And when you've got hundreds of tiny little shareholders, it's really hard to corral all those people and get their votes back in. So really, please don't do it if you can help it. And again, try to make sure that if you have to give some angels a board seat, get them sunsetted, because getting an old board of director member off the board can be exquisitely painful and a huge distraction. So just try to make that sort of automatic if you have to do that. If you are capable of demanding a minimum investment size, make it 25,000, you know, per shareholder or more if you can. If the amount of interest you have in your round is really high and you got a lot of high net worth people like physicians who are interested in it, demand 50,000 if you can do it. Once you've agreed to those main terms, the cap, the discount, and the interest rate, you present them with your term sheet. They're going to give you a term sheet that's really just going to cover most of the time just the economics. Then you hit them back with things that include the stockholder rights and other governance types of things. You want to present that to them so that you kind of have control over those aspects of what that round of investment is going to look like. And again, we've already hit that, sunsetting the board seats. All right, so now you've finished off your seed round, you're moving into venture capital, and this starts right after your seed round. So what you're going to also do is you're going to take a look at the timeline of your company, and there's a series of things that are going to happen during that timeline that incrementally reduce the risk associated with your venture. Things like you've done, you know, your proof of principle prototypes, so that takes out some of your technology risk. Then, you know, you've determined your market size and your product market fit, and you've shown that that works. You've got a solid management team on board that's done this before, or at least somebody on the group has done it before. That's sort of a human capital type risk. Then with medical devices, you have regulatory risk. So once you get your FDA either clearance or approval to market your device, that removes the regulatory risk. Then you have once that's done, then it's commercialization time. And then you have to put product on the shelf, get your sales channel filled and start selling. The last risk, of course, is the commercialization risk. Every time you knock off one of those big milestones, the perceived value of your company goes up. So what you want to do is raise only enough money to do at least one of those risk reduction milestones. And once you've done that, then you can say, hey, I've removed product market fit risk. So then you can go in and say, I'm going to do a Series A at this point, and I can demand like a higher share price. This is really good. So this is some of the, looking at these multiple rounds, here's some of the types of activities you can normally expect that these are risk reduction milestones that are going to be funded by, for example, Series A will take care of the early testing, creating your prototypes, your proof of principle prototypes, and maybe even doing some early preclinical testing if you have to do some of that. Your Series B would target, so your Series A might be $7 or $8 million, and that's going to cover all of that kind of stuff and give you runway to raise Series B, which allows you to finish your 510K submission and get it back from the FDA so that you've removed regulatory risks. That's kind of what Series B is targeted. Series B may also be, if you're doing a de novo class 2 device, first in man type study or a safety and performance study. If you need to do a Series C or a D, these things for a class 2 device, Series C would be associated with supporting commercialization, putting on a sales force, putting on inventory. If you're a class 3 device, it's going to be partially funding your pivotal trial. And if you're doing a PMA, your Series D and possibly E are going to be around for supporting the completion of your PMA. If you're a class 2 device, your Series D ought to be allowing you to really expand your sales efforts, or maybe even go international if that's a legitimate strategy for your company. If you do this correctly and you time the amounts and if the timing of the different rounds and the milestones all line up and you successfully achieve those, you're not going to get a down round. Down round means that you have a share price on Series D that's lower than the Series C share price. Like, let's say Series C was $4 per share, Series D was $3 per share. That's a down round. And that typically triggers a huge amount of dilution, which ultimately hurts the founders and the employees, the common stockholders, the most. So you really want to try to avoid that. Be smart with the amount of money you raise and achieve those goals. So this is the book that I was mentioning that it's Venture Deals, Brad Feld. The two authors are attorneys who also were venture capitalists. So they bring the venture capital perspective and the legal perspective, and they talk about all the different types of financing. They break down all the different governance terms like stock purchase agreements and investor rights and so forth. And they give you the pros and cons on those. And they bring a third person in who's an entrepreneur just to get the flip side of the table, to get that perspective. And they give numerical examples of dilution and how to do conversions and things like that. And this is a wonderful book. So if you can do it, grab this book and run with it. It's an easy read. All right, so we're gonna close things out with cap tables. And this is really my dilution example. All right, so let's get started. At startup, you've got two people who start the company. You've got a founding chief technology officer and a CEO. And you're going to issue 3 million shares and you can split it 60-40 between the CTO and the CEO. One thing I would just note, and this is a topic we can talk one-on-one at some point if anybody wants to, but please do not distribute your founder's equity equally amongst the founders. That's a recipe for disaster. And you really want to divide the equity pool up according to what you think the contributions are going to be for the following 4 years between the different individuals, not on what they've already done. that's a real key point, and that's something that I'm giving it short shrift right now, but just be aware of that. Use vesting schedules as well so that you can really try to avoid some of the founders issues that you can run into. But anyway, it's a 60-40 distribution at startup.
Oh, and hey, James, I'm just throwing out a time check. We have about 4 minutes left in the hour. So
okay, yeah. So this is like the last 3 or 4 slides, and it's just showing what happens to everybody when you start doing things. So I'll run fast. All right, so let's say you got a licensed IP from the company. Pretty typical is the university to say, I want 8% of the company. All right, you issue 8% to the company. You can see that the 60-40 split for the entrepreneurs is now dropped to like 55 and 37%. That's not a bad hit. That's not bad at all. All right, we're gonna now get ready for investors, and a smart investor is gonna demand that you create a stock option pool for employees, and they're gonna require that happens before they put in their cash. A typical number is a 20% stock option pool. And so you issue that, and you can now see that we went from 3 million shares originally. Now we're a little over 4 million, and the ownership has gone down for the 2 founders by about 25%. So it's now starting to feel a little painful. All right, so let's say the angels now come in, and they're going to get 11% of the company. So at this point, you got to issue another 500,000 shares. And you've got that 800,000 share stock option pool. So you see our founders have now gone from 60-40 to 39-26%. It's pretty painful. So this is all done on a convertible note, and we're all treating this on an as diluted basis. So that, just bear that in mind. That may not mean anything to you. Don't worry about it right now. All right, let's go to the Series A. So you bring in your venture capitalist, and you can see down here, they receive 30% of the company. You have to issue 2 million shares for them. And you can see now your founders have been diluted by over 50%. They own less than half of what they originally had. All right, that's getting painful. Now you've done 2 additional series, B and C, and you can see the type of ownership that the Series A, B, and C investors have. It's about 2/3 of the company combined. And now our CTO and CEO are down to 8% and 5% respectively. While this sounds awful, you got started, you owned these 2 people. Let's just take the CTO. He owned 60% of something that had precisely 0 value. And you have to keep that in mind, because now, when you get to this point, Series C, you're probably about cash flow break even. That means you're set up and ready to go for getting acquired. Now, if that's the case, a company like this might get acquired, like Proxima did, for 200 million. So your 8% is now worth 16 million if you cash out at that point. 8% of 200 million is a lot more than 60% of 0, and that's something you do need to kind of bear in mind. So this also indicates, there's none of the founders invested in preferred rounds. That's something I've always done. And there was no stock option grants, which is, a simplifying assumption. All right, so let's just talk real quickly. My first company, Proxima Therapeutics, we raised 50 million in VC. And here's the share prices that we did for our 5 rounds of financing. And you can see we didn't do a down round. We did a flat round from B to C. We sold the company for 200 million to SciTech. And this is the type of return that we got for the different share classes. So Series Z, they put in their money, and it was probably not even a year later we got acquired. So they got a 2x return on their money in 12 months. That is flaming awesome for them. Really good. With that, I'm going to go ahead and just stop here and not talk about COVID, because that was just not much. If there's any questions, Courtney, you want to roll with those?
Yeah, sure. So we're right at 12:30, but we did have one question come through, and maybe we can do that. And any final thoughts?
Okay.
So one question that came in was around Series A investors and what they're looking for in stock. So the question was, don't Series A investors and after typically want preferred stock, not common stock?
Oh, Series A investors they're going to demand preferred stock. That's the classic model for most of them. And if they're venture capitalists, they will demand it and they'll get it. I would note, and this has been kind of interesting, there's at least 2 companies that I'm aware of that are still in the privately held space. They haven't raised money from any venture capitalists, but they've done it from a lot of high net worth people, and they've issued only common stock to those investors. They're issuing them at, like start off at $1 a share, then it's like $2.13 a share, and then $2.87 a share. They're doing it like that. But yeah, the most common thing is if you're a venture person, they're going to demand preferred shares because you get all sorts of preferences and advantages because you have preferred shares.
Awesome, wonderful. And I do want to be respectful of time. So if you had any final last thoughts, and perhaps for the questions that are coming in, would you be okay with me just emailing them to you afterwards?
Sure.
Okay.
That would be fine.
Well, thank you again for today's talk, and thank you all for joining. We'll be able to share the recording of this talk with you all afterwards. But yeah, I think this was a great ending to this year's series, and I look forward to seeing you all in the fall.